But this was great pleasure that I present to you. He comes from the Georg-August-Universität Göttingen, which was a University of Lichtenberg, precisely. His main lines of research are on philosophy, metaphysics, and philosophy of mind of Kant, ethics, I think so, also, a little bit, German Idealism, and particularly the thought and work of Georg Christoph Lichtenberg. There's many relevant publications on various topics of his lines of research, and he published Lichtenberg's philosophical writings, which is a selection of Lichtenberg's notes from the Couve the waste books, brilliantly translated and brilliantly introduced to. And he will give us a lecture on idealism and the self in Lichtenberg.
I have a handout for this lecture, so I'll pass that around. Quotations that I'll be talking about. It's one page front and back. Thank you for the kind words, once again, Pablo, and the very kind invitation bringing me here to Santiago. I can't imagine anything better than escaping the winters in Germany. This has been perfect. So as Pablo pointed out today, I'm going to talk about idealism and the self and Lichtenberg, and give you sort of a broad understanding. Here I'm not presupposing that anybody knows anything in particular about Lichtenberg. It's just the aim is to give you a broad understanding of some aphorisms relevant to idealism and the self, and in part in his confrontation, I'd say, with Kant and with Descartes. So as for those of you who were here yesterday, you know Lichtenberg is a bit of an enigma. He wrote primarily aphorisms, or not even aphoristics. To say aphorisms, it's almost to attribute a certain style to him that is something that maybe was only developed in the 19th century. They're often just scribblings or remarks that he recorded in his notebooks, which are known as the waste books, and most were never published in his lifetime. But Goethe has a really nice statement about Lichtenberg and the sort of enigmatic character of Lichtenberg. He says, "We can use Lichtenberg's writings as the most wonderful divining rod. Where he makes a joke, there a problem lies hidden." So often this sort of witticisms and jokes or tongue-in-cheek statements that Lichtenberg makes often hide a sort of deeper problem. And the more you read Lichtenberg, the more you recognize the sort of depth of these remarks he makes. So he makes philosophical jokes and observations about the nature of the external world, about the self, about race, as we saw yesterday, religion, materialism, freedom, and scientific theories. And he's been influential for a lot of philosophers that follow him, such as Nietzsche and Wittgenstein. Benjamin also refers to Lichtenberg, and then more recently, even in contemporary analytic philosophy, people like Tyler Burge have been interested in things that Lichtenberg says, particularly about the self. So in this talk, I'm going to look at his thoughts on idealism and the self captured in one of his most famous and influential remarks. That's the K76 notebook entry. I'll be referring to the notebook entries by a letter and a number. That's how they're organized. They go from A to G, I think. With A being texts that were written at an earlier period. Okay, so here's this famous and very important remark he makes. We become conscious of certain representations that are not dependent upon us. Others, at least we believe, are dependent upon us. Where is the boundary? We know only the existence of our sensations, representations, and thoughts. It thinks, we should say, just as we say, it likens. To say cogito is already too much if we translate it as I think. To assume the I, to postulate it, is a practical necessity. So Lichtenberg, like Descartes, asks us to adopt a sort of attitude of doubt. But in contrast with Descartes' rationalism, he believes that we should accept knowledge. We should accept items as knowledge only if we can confirm them in experience. So in contrast with Descartes' rationalism, Lichtenberg proposes a sort of a more of an empiricist view of epistemology. So on this basis, Lichtenberg questions the naive view that we perceive objects that exist independent of us. He appears to rely on Descartes' idea that we attribute so-called adventitious ideas to mind-independent objects. In the Meditations, Descartes feels, if you'll recall, Descartes feels the sensation of heat from the fire. And he experiences this sensation of heat whether he wants to or not. And he tells us, from this we conclude that sensations arise from a source independent of the mind. Sensations that are dependent on our will are somehow mind-dependent, while those that are not are considered mind-independent. This is sort of the context in which Lichtenberg is beginning to think, I think, about sensations and sensations that are dependent upon us and so on. The K64 aphorism, which was written around the time of the K76 aphorism, it comes from a period in which Lichtenberg is also very engaged with Kant, so this is 1793 to 1796. According to Lichtenberg, in the K64 remark, he says, we attribute representations that are dependent on us to a source that is internal to us. Here's quote number 2. We sense modifications and impressions within us, the ground for which we seek also within us because we're conscious of the fact that they are dependent upon us or are within us. And he tells us that we attribute representations that are not dependent on our will to a source outside us in objects that are distinct from us or praeter nos. This is nicely formulated in the third quote. There are also impressions regarding which we sense in an overwhelmingly convincing way that we're merely a receptive subject. Perhaps it would be enough to say here that such objects are praeter nos, something distinct from us. So how exactly does Lichtenberg distinguish between representations that have their source within us and those that have their source outside of us? Like Descartes, he distinguishes between them according to their dependence on our will. Whereas fantasies and reflections appear to be dependent on our will, that is, we can will to think about things. I can will to imagine a dinosaur right now and so on. Whereas fantasies and reflections appear to be dependent on the will, sensations and impressions appear to be independent of our will. The former have their source in ourselves, whereas the latter do not. The source of representations that are not dependent on our will is in objects praeter nos. So just as with Descartes, we experience certain sensations that do not seem to be dependent on our will, and from that we make an inference that these come from some kind of object that's independent of us. For Descartes, that's the fire that's causing the sensation of heat. And Lichtenberg's pretty consistent about this throughout his writings, and it also forms the basis of his theory of natural science too. So it's something that he develops in conjunction with his thinking about Kant and Descartes, and then also moves it into his teaching on physics. So he was primarily a physicist. He taught experimental physics, and he uses this discussion of objects greater nos to provide a sort of a philosophical foundation for his work in the natural science. But there are a couple of objections that you could raise to the way Lichtenberg explains this difference between representations. You might wonder, what about pains or emotions, for example? Pains or emotions, it seems, might be subject to their will. I can will to be sad because someone said something offensive to me, or I can will to be happy about it, something like that. You could think that pains and emotions just arrive to us and we don't have any sort of say about them. In that case, they're not subject to our will. So we have here, so let's say pains and emotions, they're not subject to our will, but they don't have their source in objects greater nos, right? They don't have their source in objects independent of us. My feeling of sadness or something didn't arise independent of any sort of object causing that emotion. But Lichtenberg doesn't consider those sorts of objections at all, but it's sort of worth keeping in mind. In contrast with Descartes, Lichtenberg also distinguishes between objects greater nos, which he sometimes calls objects without us, or beyond us, or in German Jenseits, and objects extra nos, which he glosses as outside us, or außer uns. Objects greater nos are putative mind-independent causes of our unwilled representations, whereas objects extra nos are objects that are in some sense spatially external to us. We often conflate the two and think that objects greater nos are spatially external to us. But it's at least conceivable for Lichtenberg that there are mind-independent sources of our representations in objects that are not located in space, or even, that are not located spatially external to us. But that's even that's very difficult to understand what that could possibly mean. But I think what he means here is that we can have these they could be mind-independent sources of our representations in objects that are not spatially located. So how do we arrive at the idea of objects extra nos from the idea of objects greater nos? Lichtenberg picks up these ideas again in the J notebook. This is from 1789 to 1793, so it actually precedes the K76 remark. It shows that he was thinking about it even very early. He says, outside us, it is certainly difficult to say how we arrived at this concept, for we actually merely sense things within us. To sense something outside oneself is a contradiction. We sense things only within ourselves, and what we sense is a mere modification of ourself, and thus within us. Because these alterations are not dependent upon us, we ascribe them to other things that are outside us, and say that they are things we should call greater nos. But for greater, we substitute the preposition extra, which is something entirely different. That we think of these things as being in a space outside us is clearly not a matter of sensation. It seems to be something that is most intimately interwoven with the nature of our sensible faculty of cognition. It is the form in which the representation of something greater nos is given to us, the form of sensibility. So what he's saying here is there's little reason to think that an object praeter nos should be equated with an object extra nos. What does he mean by that? Well, his use of the term form of sensibility here lends some clarity to it. I think in this period, so 1789, Kant published the first edition of the first critique in 1781. Lichtenberg read it almost immediately. It was being discussed by everybody in Germany and most certainly in Göttingen at the time. And so he's really thinking through it for several years. And I think what he's doing is relying on the Kantian idea that our forms of intuition lead us to represent objects in space and in time, although Lichtenberg doesn't explicitly talk about time here. But this doesn't entail that the objects as they are in themselves, independent of our minds, are located in space. He suggests this view throughout his lectures on physics. As I mentioned, he uses it and with explicit reference to Kant as a sort of foundation for his physics. Although he had this idea that he would write a physics compendium on this basis, so he would actually introduce his epistemology first and then build up all of the sort of particular physics after that, but he doesn't really ever get around to it, unfortunately. So he suggests this view throughout his lectures on physics, and as early as the H notebook, that's in 1784 already, so almost immediately after, 3 years, but it was the 18th century. They didn't, everybody didn't get an instant message every time someone published something. So this is put really nicely in quote number 5 here. It says, "When I say that all bodies occupy space, I'm saying something quite real because I'm speaking about the relation of these bodies to me. But to claim that bodies occupy a space in an objective sense is as nonsensical as attributing a color or even a language to these things. So according to Lichtenberg, spatial properties are like secondary qualities, so we see him comparing them to color, comparing spatial location to color here, or even language, which is, I'm not quite sure what could possibly mean there, but color at least seems to be a clear reference to secondary qualities. Objects praeter nos do not necessarily possess such spatial properties, i.e. objects praeter nos are not necessarily extra nos. Mind-independent objects praeter nos are objects independent of our spatial form of sensibility. Yeah, space. If you compare that with Kant, as I said, it's very close. Quotation 6 from the A edition of the first critique sums this up nicely. The expression outside us carries with it an unavoidable ambiguity, since it sometimes signifies something that, which as a thing in itself exists distinct from us, and sometimes merely something that belongs to outer appearance. So just as Kant denies things in themselves exist in space, Lichtenberg denies objects praeter nos are extra nos. In this sense, objects praeter nos for Lichtenberg are very close to Kantian things in themselves. They're objects as they exist independent of the mind, i.e. independent of the mind's way of spatially organizing the world. And for Lichtenberg, we're never actually aware of objects praeter nos, right? We only draw a conclusion about their existence because they appear independent of our will, or at least the representations that we have are independent of our will, so from that we infer that they have their cause in some kind of object praeter nos. This again is, so we could kind of see in K76 now, this sort of becomes a little bit more clear what he's saying here. We become conscious of certain representations that are not dependent upon us. Others, at least we believe, are dependent upon us. Where is the boundary? We know only the existence of our sensations, representations, and thoughts. So we're not aware of objects praeter nos. That's just sort of an inference we make to their existence as the cause of representations that are independent of our will. What we are actually only conscious of are our mental states, such as sensations, representations, and thoughts. So we can't actually know whether mind-independent objects, Prater knows, exist, very similar to at least one reading of Kant. He writes, for example, in Notebook L, 1796 to 1799, there's no bridge that leads beyond our thoughts to the objects. So the position here, as I pointed out, somewhat seems to rely on an empiricist view, though, that all knowledge must come from sensation. So he's not doing transcendental philosophy like Kant. He starts from an empiricist view. What can we know based on what we experience? So he seems to rely on an empiricist view that all knowledge must come from sensation. We can only have knowledge of our conscious mental states, and this also, as I pointed out, fits well with his scientific methodology, where, in contrast, for example, with people who were still doing physics in an Aristotelian vein and talking about various causes and so on, Lichtenberg is really doing early experimental physics. In this empiricist thing. However, this empirical starting point leads him into an idealism, into a form of idealism. That is because we can only know our sensations. Right? But you might wonder, is it an epistemological kind of idealism, or is it metaphysical idealism? That is, does Lichtenberg think we can only know our conscious sensations, etc.? Or does he think that only our conscious sensations exist? So is he able does he move from the claim that we only know our sensations to the claim that objects Prater knows don't exist at all? And this, in order to sort of get clear on this, we have to look at, I think, the reception of Kant, of Kant's first critique, of the first edition of it in Göttingen. So Lichtenberg was really influenced by the reception of the first edition of Kant's Critique of Pure Reason in Göttingen, by a reception that's encapsulated in a review of the first critique written by Feder and Garve. And in this text, they held that Kant was Berkeley an idealist, i.e. someone who held that objects Prater knows don't exist at all. Right? We only have ideas. So Lichtenberg's response to the Feder-Garve review lends some depth to his view about objects Prater knows. And I think what's also interesting is that Lichtenberg seems to offer an interpretation of Kant that is really actually ahead of his time, and it's only recently been taken up by some Kant scholars such as Lucy L.A. and Tobias Roosevelt. So this is again from the H19 remark. This is number 8 here. All that I perceive is indeed due only to me, and every effect of the thing external to me is indeed the truth. What more as humans do we expect? It's a radical error on the part of those who dispute the Kantian conception that they believe it would be idealism or even a deception perpetrated by the creator of nature if Kant were correct. When I say that all bodies occupy space, I'm saying something quite real because I'm speaking about the relation of these bodies to me. But to claim that bodies occupy a space in an objective sense is as nonsensical as attributing a color or even a language to these things. So I think here is where he's offering a sort of defense of Kant against this criticism raised by Feder and Garve that Kant was a Berkeleyan idealist, in which subsequently Kant has to also defend himself against in the second edition of the first critique, and primarily in the refutation of idealism. So Lichtenberg argues that for Kant, spatial properties are relational properties of objects, which they have in relation to a subject. And I think what he's doing here is he relies on the Lockean distinction between primary and secondary qualities. And he says, right, so the spatiality of objects is something that these objects acquire insofar as they're related to us, in the same way that objects acquire a color through their relation to our perceptive faculties. And that is something that I don't think anybody was proposing at the time as a reading of Kant, and as one that's only fairly recently been worked out in detail. If we take this as this H19 remark as reflective of Lichtenberg's own thinking about objects Prater knows, then you might think that he might have thought that there are mind-independent objects Prater knows that appear as objects extra knows given our forms of sensibility. Right? So, given their relation to us, they take on a form of, they take on some sort of spatial location in their relation to us. So that's one. So that's one way we can understand them. In that case, he's saying objects Prater knows exist, and so he's not offering a sort of metaphysical idealism at all. Actually, some kind of form of realism. Or you can think he maintains that we can't have knowledge of objects Prater knows, so objects for us are only representations. I think while the first version is a very interesting interpretation of Kant's, I think it's actually the latter view that he holds, namely that we can have knowledge only of our representations. We can't say anything about the existence of objects Prater knows. This kind of idealism presents problems for him when it comes to explaining how our judgments about objects Prater knows can be true or false. That's something he deals with in his writings on physics, right? So if he starts from this idea that we can only have knowledge of our sensations, we can't have any knowledge of objects Prater knows, then how can we make true or false claims about objects as they are outside of our representations? And that's something that that is a challenge for him. We see him kind of working through it, I think, in several aphorisms where he seems to suggest that a kind of coherentist idea of truth, where our judgments about objects are true just in case they cohere intersubjectively with other judgments or cohere with our own internal Gedankensystem, internal thinking on things. Obviously, that's not as good as Kant's solution, maybe, but it's an interesting one, nevertheless. Okay, and so his idealism, he develops this sort of idealism, and then I think it also plays into a lot of what he says about language. So beyond this epistemological idealism, he appears to hold a linguistic form of idealism, according to which language plays a mediating role in structuring our representations. Language determines what kinds of representations we have, and thus what kinds of objects and properties exist for us. And I think that's why he proposes a critique of language that sparks the interest of Wittgenstein and others. This is nicely formulated in remarks 9 and 10, where he says, for example, the synonyms of a language portray, at least in part, the remnants of a nation's knowledge, just as the language of a people contains its common philosophy, or our false philosophy is embodied in our entire language, or what I pointed out yesterday with respect to race, that there's a sense in which we create races by naming them, and what he suggests we do is criticize that, is work through our understanding of how it is that we arrive at those concepts and why it is that we use them, what the value of using them is, and so on. Okay, so So that captures the first part of this very deep aphorism, the case or remark, the K76 one. It captures, I think, and explains the idealism part of it. Now, what about then he starts talking about the self in this shift. So the clear statement on the self can be found in that K76 remark. Unfortunately, the original text of that remark is lost, so there are all these questions about how exactly we're supposed to read it, and there's debates about punctuation and so on. But in the version that I present here, this is the version presented by his son in the original edition of his works, and so I assume that he had access to the original text. And I also don't understand why it would make philological sense for someone later who doesn't have the original to come along and suggest that it should be punctuated differently. It doesn't really make sense to me. Okay, so let's look at the K76 again, the latter part of it. We know only the existence of our sensations, representations, and thoughts. It thinks, we should say, just as we say, it lightens. To say cogito is already too much if we translate it as I think. To assume the I, to postulate it, is a practical necessity. So, Lichtenberg, again, I think presents an epistemic challenge to Descartes' cogito judgment here, I think. I think what he's suggesting is that when we introspect, when we look at the sensations that are appearing to us, we find no self or I beyond the representations of inner sense. And since we can know only our own representations, we cannot know that such an I or self exists. So we're warranted only in using the impersonal formulation, it thinks, as in thinking is happening, or it lightnings, where it has no reference in such cases. It doesn't refer to a substantial persisting entity, but is the bearer of the properties of inner sense. So I think in this regard he's criticizing rationalist views of the soul, for example, somewhat in the vein of Kant's paralogisms, but coming from a different angle, but nevertheless criticizing rationalist views of the soul that Kant's presented by Baumgarten and Wolff. He's skeptical about their metaphysical reasoning because it has no empirical basis. And I think this is part of his general critique of metaphysics and its conflation of what can be cognized or known empirically, what we have knowledge of through our sensations, and what's merely conceivable. That can be found in his writings on physics, where he criticizes the use of or reference to occult qualities in physics at the time, and Aristotelian physics. How can we make sense of the latter part of the remark on this self? Well, I mean, it initially bears some similarities to Hume's statement in the Treatise from 1739. Lichtenberg was an avid reader of Hume. Hume says, "For my part, when I enter most intimately into what I call myself, I always stumble on some particular perception or other of heat or cold, light or shade, love or hatred, pain or pleasure. I never can catch myself at any time without a perception, and never can observe anything but the perception." The view of the self being presented here, I think, also fits with Lichtenberg's views on consciousness and inner sense and related marks. One of these is presented in the H notebook at page 142, where it says, "An animal is for itself always a subject, while man is for himself also an object." And again, around the same period, he indicates a similar distinction, writing, "I and myself, I feel myself. These are two different things." Those statements are also related to fragments surrounding the K76 remark on the I. Here's one from K64, again, number 14 on the quotations. We are conscious of the state of our soul at every moment. When I say something occurs within me, I'm experiencing it with inner sense. Here we ourselves are object and observer, object and subject. So in these statements, the ones I pointed out here, Lichtenberg points to a difference between our awareness of our sensations in inner sense and a kind of second-order reflective awareness of ourselves, where we ourselves become the object of awareness. The language in the H142 and H146 remarks, however, is somewhat misleading, and it does conflict with the K76 remark, because he speaks of our awareness of ourselves as an I or as a me, which is exactly what he denies in K76. But leaving aside his use of I and me here, the clear point seems to be there are two kinds of awareness of sensations and reflective awareness of the self. Awareness of ourselves as a subject and awareness of ourselves as an object. Which is something that also becomes important for Wittgenstein later, possibly on the basis of his readings of Lichtenberg. So the point in the K76 remark, I think, is that we cannot locate a substantial self reflectively through inner sense, and that all we experience are conscious sensations, representations, and thoughts. We're conscious of ourselves as the subject of thoughts, but not reflectively conscious of ourselves as a substantial, persisting object or an I. And the point, I think, is not primarily metaphysical, but it's epistemic. If we recall the nature of this idealism, the idea is that here is we have no epistemic warrant for regarding the self as a persisting subject, not that such a persisting subject is impossible or doesn't exist, right? It doesn't, and it can't go that far, is to say that. I mean, whatever, you can raise all sorts of objections to the view, but so while the point of the K76 remark, I think, is primarily epistemic with regard to the self, he does have some other remarks where I think he presents a positive view of what the self could be and what we should regard the self as being like. So he appears ultimately, I think, to have a kind of bundle theory of the self. I think it's relying in some ways on Humean and some kind of Humean-Lockean combination. And he seems to suggest that personal identity, that is the identity of ourselves across time, consists in the continuous interconnection of representations through memory, regardless of their material basis. So we persist as a self as long as we have an interrelated string of memories. Whether those memories can be attributed to a soul, we don't know, right? Because we have no knowledge of anything other than our sensations. So, given that, the way that it seems like he's suggesting that we think about the self is just the self exists so long as there's interrelated and interconnected memories. This is captured in number 15, this is K54, and in number 16, which is K162. He says, to die and become animate again with the memory of one's previous existence we call being unconscious. And then 16. As long as our memory lasts, a multitude of individuals work together united as one, the 20-year-old, the 30-year-old, and so on. But as soon as it fails, we come to stand more and more alone, and the whole generation of eyes withdraws and sneers at the feeble old man. And so I think that's a very, very sort of similar view to Locke's conception of personal identity. Lichtenberg, he doesn't ever explicitly refer to Locke's conception of personal identity, but but he does make references to articles in some journals at the time in which it was being discussed, so it's clear that he's at least aware of it. So just to remind you again of what Locke says. For since consciousness always accompanies thinking, and 'tis that makes everyone to be what he calls self, and thereby distinguishes himself from all other thinking things, and this alone consists personal identity, i.e., the sameness of a rational being. And as far as this consciousness can be extended backwards to any past action or thought, so far it reaches the identity of that person. It's the same self now it was then, as it was then. And 'tis by the same self with this present one that now reflects on it that the action was done. So I think that's when he does speak of a kind of positive view of what the self could consist in. I think those are very useful aphorisms for trying to figure out what he could have possibly been thinking about there. But that doesn't, he doesn't say that in the K76 remark, and I primarily want to just try to clarify or make sense of the K76 remark. So let's look at it again. There's one last line here. So to say cogito is already too much if we translate it as I think. To assume the I, to postulate it, is a practical necessity. So what are we to make of this idea that it's a practical necessity or to posit the I? So I think there are a couple of options. So one, you could think it's a grammatical necessity. In keeping with this philosophy of language, by representing ourselves as an I, we make the I a real thing. So we should undertake a critique of language and not use the I. That could be part of the criticism here, right? When we use the I, we make it sort of a real thing, and all of a sudden it becomes a substance, and so on and so forth, and we build a kind of philosophy on that basis. In part, what you could think is here he's undertaking a criticism of our use of the term I. While it's an interesting suggestion, he never develops it anywhere. But I think, I pointed this out here, there's a shift in his use of the I from the H146 remark to refer to our awareness of oneself as a subject versus me as awareness of oneself as an object. There's a shift there from that to abandoning the use of the I in the K76 remark. So in earlier texts, he's using it still, I as opposed to me, and so on. And then we get to K76, and he does away with the I. And I think you could argue that represents him critiquing language in this way. He recognizes that he's been using the I in this way prior to that, and then by the K76 remark, he's able to move away from that. But he doesn't develop that anywhere. So that's one way we can read what's going on there. Or there's a second option. Or Lichtenberg means we have to posit the existence of a persisting I or self to make sense of actions, intentions, and attributions of praise and blame. I think that would be sort of in a Kantian vein with Lichtenberg's own sort of take on this. So in this Kantian vein that we have to assume the existence of the soul, for example, and its identity to make sense of moral responsibility and to make sense of God's punishment or rewards for us in the afterlife. So that could be the sort of practical necessity of positing an I. But I think also maybe the first and second readings are potentially related and can be reconciled. Maybe the idea here is that we have to undertake a criticism of our use of I and what we believe it entails, but we can also recognize that reference to an I in our language allows for moral responsibility and so on, attributions of actions to persons and so on. And in that sense, it's a practical necessity. So that gets us, at least he shows how we can take the step of criticism, show that the I doesn't exist in the way that we might have thought it did, and yet we can still postulate it because we recognize that there's some use for it. So that's what I have on this K76 remark.
First of all, thank you for the very interesting talk you gave. I have a question concerning the quote 14. Because when you read the quote 14, you made this reference to the well-known relationship between Wittgenstein and Lichtenberg. It was then, or isn't it?
In part, I mean, I think what I was just pointing to is this awareness of ourselves as a subject and awareness.
Yeah, that's because I think this is the, if you were thinking about the well-known passages in the Blue Book, where he makes this distinction between subjective and objective uses of I, that you were thinking about. And my question would be, that there is an idea which is very important in this discussion that Wittgenstein is making there, namely the idea that you can question if the pronoun I is a referential expression or not. And since you didn't use this insight, so to speak, in your conference, I was wondering what you can say about it. If this difference between referential and non-referential uses of I could help to interpret the different things that Lichtenberg says about the use of the pronoun I. Because I think it could be very illuminating, very wonderful.
Yeah.
And maybe referring to this idea of the practical necessity, because I mean, Wittgenstein's point is actually that there are some uses of I in which we cannot err.
In which we cannot,
we cannot err. I mean, when it came in the subjective use of I, for example, this kind of expressive use of I. I mean, the point there is, and I think it could be a sort of practical necessity to understand some uses of I as uses in which you cannot err. When you, for example, say, I'm doing something, I was the one who had done X, Y, Z, or something like this.
I'm having trouble remembering what exactly Wittgenstein's error, what his examples are of I statements that wouldn't be subject to an error. Are there kinds of things like,
this is for example,
I say I'm hungry, but you can't wonder if it was me who was hungry. Is that
something like that. Mm-hmm. Or is this such uses of I are like mourning, for example? And the attribution question, for example, is if the one with the red pullover, for example, is me or another person, is relevant in non-practical contexts, I think. I mean, the idea could, to a certain point, be the same.
Yeah, I'm not sure what to say about it. I mean, there's one remark that suggests that, and Pablo mentioned it yesterday. It's something like where he says to say I is already too much, or that's superfluous, or something like that. He says I don't know, I'm doing something. Oh no, that's superfluous. Of course it's me. That kind of suggests this idea that maybe that we can't err in our use of, or in our attributions of things to ourselves, and certainly not with respect to our what we for him experience in inner sense. The idea that you wonder, there are representations occurring. Are they occurring to me or something like that? Could I be wrong about saying that I'm thinking about something like that? Might be a way of sort of thinking through whether he was actually anticipating Wittgenstein in a sort of robust sort of way. Does that help?
I ask it because I think the idea that to postulate the I could be a practical necessity could mean something like the following thing. There are some certain contexts in which the question who, for example, is the one who did X, or who is the one who is mourning, for example, or is to a certain point irrelevant.
But then why does he suggest that it's a practical necessity? I guess that's what the part I don't understand.
Because in such contexts, you are not actually asking, for example, what exactly is the entity who or what did X or Y. I mean, are not to this point theoretical contexts.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's not something that's a subject of or requiring theoretical reflection in order to sort of establish whether it was me or not who was having those experiences, something like that. Right? The practical necessity. Well, I guess that's the part I'm having trouble understanding, is that the practical necessity is just that we do that and we don't need to reflect on it theoretically. We just attribute representations to ourselves in a way that, in some obvious way,
and not always representations, but for example, actions. I mean, that's a typical example. For example, of subjective uses of I, self-attribution of intentional actions.
Yeah.
You're not identifying for example, when I say I'm doing X or Y, I'm not identifying something and then predicating of this thing that I identified, that this thing is the one. Or the thing that have done X or Y. I mean, if someone asks me when I say I have done X or Y, who actually was the one? my answer would be, who cares?
Yeah. I mean, how could it be? Yeah, I mean,
how could it be relevant?
Yeah. In a way, I think it sort of relates to this idea that in using the I, one way to understand that is that we in some practical way begin to accept responsibility for actions. These sort of things, we assert I'm the one that's done this thing, and in doing so, we accept all of those sort of practical consequences that come along with that regarding praise or blame for our actions and so on, in a way that is not one that's right. We don't need to reflect on it theoretically. We just use the I in these contexts and enter into the sort of practical sphere. So, does that help? Or?
Yeah. I don't want to monopolize the... No, that's what you want. No, I don't want to.
No, yeah. You were reminding us about this quotation on the superfluity of the I. I was also recalling this quotation about your lecture, and I was wondering about the terms that Lichtenberg uses in this text. The term, I don't remember what is the German term for superfluous. It is not überflüssig. It is another term, I think. In fact, I'm not sure. I'm not sure. But I would like to take this term superfluous. That's pretty superfluous. And the other term, the term of the question, who's there? And in the first place, I was wondering what means superfluous there. For instance, it would mean obvious. It's absolutely obvious. That's me. Who's there? And that takes us back to this there. What means there in this case? It's not, of course, a position in space. It's more a sort of ideal position, ideal place, so to say. And this ideal place would be something that obviousness, the obviousness of the question, the obviousness of the answer. And that could be a mode of understanding this practical necessity. I don't know if you can say something about that.
Yeah, I mean, I had never really thought about that remark about the I being superfluous until you mentioned it yesterday. So, yeah, I mean, I think that we could develop that along the lines of what Luis was suggesting with this sort of I being just sort of a practical necessity and not something worthy of, or not something requiring theoretical reflection.
Yeah.
And then the idea then the sort of question of where is the self, I mean, it in a way is also superfluous in the same way when we begin acting using the I in this sort of practical sphere or something like that. I guess if you mean by sort of like where are our physical boundaries, where do I start and you end, and that's sort of how do we individuate persons, then I guess that would be something that's also that occurs within the practical sphere. Maybe what we're willing to accept, what kind of world we're willing to accept. For example, one in which I don't know, I go rob a bank and you're punished for it because we are somehow physically the same, or occupying some really strange same space. And that's where I think, where this sort of criticism comes in, where we would need to reflect on what's contained in this sort of insane, I'm doing something, or I take responsibility for some action, or so on. Should those kind of statements just be taken as sort of pointing or individuating the I as just what we typically think of as a person with a physical body and so on, or is it something that, as I suggested, has something to do with the interconnectedness of our memory, right? We're individuated in that way. So when I say, I don't know, I robbed the bank, well, it's because that's interconnected somehow in my memories. and it doesn't make any sort of reference to myself as a physical being in space. But that's not to say that it couldn't, and it seems like that's where the sort of practical reflection, or reflection on our use of the eye. Does that answer your question somewhat, or give you something to think about?
Yeah.
Hi, and congratulations on the conference. I think that because of the eye, it is some could be an automatism. I remember of the conference of yesterday. That art could be an automatic. Well, I think that now we'll make a lot of distinction between different terms and concepts. This is, I think, it's relevant in the topic or the investigation about Lichtenberg studies. And the topic about the distinction, the differentiation between representations and objects. I think because I have a lot of comments, very interesting. But I think my question could be goes in this way, the distinction between representation and object, because well, stop there maybe. I think thanks.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think if you I think there definitely is a way of understanding how our use of the eye is sort of automatism in a way, right? It's something that we just do. We've done for a long time.
You instead.
Yeah, and I mean, what we need is a sort of critique of that, and that's what gets us into the perspective to wonder whether or not our use of the eye is the right one, or what's contained in the eye is the right sort of idea. And then the representations, I mean, I guess it's just the way I'm thinking about the K76 remark is just from a very sort of traditional history of philosophy angle, where I try to look at what were people saying around Lichtenberg at the time, what would they have been thinking about, what was he reading, in order to sort of establish what he might have meant by the things that he says. And so when I think in the 17th, 18th century context, if you're taking Kant and Descartes, and it's very sort of clear that there's a subject and then there are objects, subjects have representations of objects, how do we get from the subject to the objects? How do we understand what it means to make true statements about objects and so on? But I think one nice thing about Lichtenberg is we don't have to read him historically. There are other ways to begin thinking about representations and so on that are maybe suggested by the text that this kind of historical reading might overlook. Or did you have something else in mind about representations?
No. Just, I mean, the problem of language. Maybe I take the problem in this way. The language as a representation, or the representation how. Representation without object could be a way of the form to manifestation of the language. Could be the entry to read another another way to Lichtenberg approach of language, on the figures, idea of the Gedankensystem, on how to put the language up. But it's not the problem of the language, of the forms, or the aphorism. Is the way in what we representing. But the question, I mean, it's representation without object. If I understand something about that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess his sort of idealism gets us away from objects in a way. Although I think when he's writing about physics, he's really concerned with trying to get clear on how our representations can be true or false and that sort of stuff, because it matters for science. But I think one way definitely to look at what he does is to say he gets us away from thinking about objects and just into a world in which we're thinking about sensations and how sensations, or how representations, maybe is better, just representations work, and how they are either always, or it's not so clear, but we could say maybe they're always linguistic in nature. We always represent the world, not as individua, right? We don't represent particulars. It's always filtered through language and representing things in a general way, and so on. And that, I mean, I think one way, it seems like you could take that in the direction of looking at what he says about, for example, literary representation or poetry or something like that. What he does with language there. Or, yeah.
Estoy de acuerdo con I think it's very interesting indeed about the problem of the body, in the sense that you explain that.
Please. Paul.
Hi.
Okay. Go on.
Hi, Steve. Thank you for coming. I have a question concerning the subject. Would you say this subject is somehow unperceivable in Lichtenberg? Because it's like the eye is a location in space where the objects are perceived. We can know about the space in terms of relation and the objects, but can we know a subject in its subjectivity?
I mean, I think the K76 remark suggests that we can, we have a sort of first personal awareness of our sensations. And in that way, and this maybe it sort of dovetails with the practical aspect of it. We have this sort of first personal awareness. We go around using the I in a way that refers to that sort of first personal awareness that we have. And in that sense, it seems like we're aware of ourselves as subjects, but not in the way that someone in the 18th century might have argued that you're aware of your soul or something like that as a substance, right? That's not something that I think we're not aware of ourselves as subjects in that way, right? We're just aware of sort of sensations and so on. And our representations, maybe how they cohere with one another, but not aware of ourselves as a subject in this kind of other sense of, being a substantial soul or something like that. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Please.
Well, I want to push a little bit more
Go for it.
with my first suggestion. I mean, the idea seems to be, if I understand your interpretation of or the passage, I think, the idea seems to be a sort of Kantian point. So you have this intentional consciousness, a sort of intentional consciousness. I mean, a form of relationship between a subject and object. That is what he means, I think, when he says we know only the existence of our sensations, representations, and thoughts. I mean, that means something like we are conscious of a relationship between subject-object or something like that. Or we have a sort of intentional consciousness. We have representations of. Something like that. And it's not clear what actually the status of the object side and the subject side is. I mean, then appears this question of the object of representation is praeternos, extranos, and so on. But one can ask the same question from the subject side. What is this I in this relationship? And I would say his point is to a certain point a Wittgensteinian point, to say actually in this structure I think it is to a certain point irrelevant to the question, what is this I? Because this word I it doesn't identify anything. It's not referential. I think that's the point with the use of or with this substitution move from I to it, because this it is impersonal. It's a kind of grammatical necessity. You have to have a sort of grammatical subject there, but this subject doesn't refer to anything. It is to a certain point exactly the same point as in the that Wittgenstein make in the Blue Book and in the philosophical investigations, that the word I is does not refer. And then you can ask yourself, then why do we use the word? And then comes the answer, it is a practical necessity. It is just the way it is expressive. So I think the point is to a certain point the same.
Yeah, I mean, I can definitely see that. I guess the way that I was thinking through it, though, is that there is a kind of disanalogy between thinking of objects and thinking of this a subject here in this in the remark, because at least as I develop it, we're in the surrounding remarks, he's really trying to get clear on how it is that we can move from sensations to the claim that those are caused by objects, or something like that, right? And how do we get there? Well, we notice some are dependent on our will and some aren't. And I don't see that there's not an analogous question with regard to the self there, right? So he doesn't ask, here I have some self-like representation. What allows me to say that those are caused by some objective self that's independent of my representations? That kind of question doesn't really make sense. It seems like it doesn't make sense, right? I think there's some disanalogy, I guess, between the sort of reasoning or something about the objective side of things and the reasoning about the subjective side of things. But I think that doesn't preclude that the point that he's making with regard to the I being a practical necessity is this sort of Wittgensteinian point. I mean, I think that could be true. Although at the same time, I think it could be this sort of Kantian point as well. I mean, because that's just who he's reading at the point when he says, to posit the I as a practical necessity. What he's saying here is to posit the I as a substantial substance and so on. It's a practical necessity. For the reasons that Kant says, about reward and punishment and so on in the groundwork. And that sort of moves us away, though, from the Wittgensteinian point, and they're almost, in a way, they can. I don't know that they can.
But I would say that Kant also defends this Wittgensteinian point. For example, in the second paralogism, as he makes this distinction between subjective and objective uses of I, where subjective uses of I are actually, I would say at least, non-referential uses.
Yeah, I mean, for sure. And then I'm not so clear, though, with Kant how to reconcile that with the idea, though, that we have to think of the I as a soul or something like that. That comes in later, right? So maybe we have this sort of subjective use of it, but in order for ethics to work and so on, we've got to start thinking of it as a persistent soul substance. Does that make sense? Or maybe you disagree about the concept.
I'm not sure. I think he refers to this subjective use in order to explain what is the function of this I in I think. I mean, the idea is that the I does not refer in I think.
I mean, I think that's right. That's the sort of critical point in the paralogisms against Wolff and all these people. But then the interesting thing about Kant is then when we get to the practical philosophy, he brings God and he brings all of the things from the second part of the first critique back in, right, as practical necessities that have to be posited. So we get God again, and we get a soul again. And I guess so. One way I would just need to understand how the subjective use of the I and this practical use of the I are related in Kant, and then also, potentially in Lichtenberg as well, if we want to think of him as making this sort of point about the I being non-referential, but also I think at the same time relying on this Kantian idea from the practical philosophy. But it's, of course, like all you get is, you know, a sentence, and it's very hard to, you know, but maybe you could say, do you have any thoughts about how those are related in Kant, how we get from a non-referential use of I to a more use of I?
Point. I mean, the main idea, I think, is the following. There is a very important passage in the introduction, in the second edition, where he says that there are two forms of knowledge, practical and theoretical knowledge, and that in theoretical knowledge, the direction of fit, to speak, is inverse, as done in practical knowledge. Indeed, it is the thing which makes proof the judgment, and in practical knowledge is exactly the other way around. And I mean, this idea is linked to the point that in practical uses, I is not referential. It is to a certain point expressive or something. So, I mean, it is not constitutive knowledge, but a sort of practical knowledge, a sort of uses of representations or of thought that makes true what they think or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I can see that in the sort of the practical uses of the I, but I still don't. I mean, it's always for me. This is just a struggle between when Kant is doing epistemology and when he's doing some kind of strange metaphysics under the guise of his practical philosophy. Because it seems like I mean, we're, you know, in the when we're using the I in a sort of practical context, we're using it in a way, or need to use it in a way that brings in this metaphysical conception of the self as a sort of persisting substance, because that's what makes later allows for us to make sense of punishment in the afterlife. So we have, like, I can definitely see, you know, it's very clear in the B edition, for example, this practical use of the I in the revisions in the B edition of the paralogisms. But then, and often in Kant scholarship, you get that reading, or you get the metaphysical reading, and there's it's very hard to sort of to reconcile the two. But I mean, I wonder if you would think that when we're using the I in this sort of practical way, does that brings with it this practical understanding of the I as a substantial soul, which, you know, puts Kant very, very much much closer to his predecessors than a lot of people would want to say. But yeah, that seems to be one of those sort of irreconcilable things about Kant interpretation, depending on which sort of starting point you take. You know, whether you take it the sort of metaphysical starting point or more practical action oriented.
Any other questions?
I'm wondering if the question of practical necessity that you are debating can be think of the same, similar, or is a complete different issue if we're thinking in the authorial use of the I. When I decide to tell a story in the first person, or hide myself in the third person. If it is the same I that I use it when I tell a story, it's a completely different kind of I.
Yeah, I guess if you think of like James Joyce's Ulysses and the way that Ulysses was written, and the interesting thing about it is when the narrator, what he does with the narrator is in a way takes the I out. It's clear that there is a narrator, but often he's not saying I did this or something like that. We just get this sort of flow of impressions that the narrator has of what's going on. And in a way, I think that's, if we think of, when he says it thinks, and when he's describing just sort of sensations occurring, that's sort of what he's, when I think of it, I think of him as describing that sort of experience as opposed to the experience where, you say, I went to the grocery store yesterday and I did this or did that, it's something like a description of what the grocery store was like and what the impressions were like that I was having. But in that case, it's clear that those are, I guess, happening to someone, or in this way, it doesn't make sense to wonder whether or not they're happening to you. But the I is, it's not sort of explicitly there, I guess. But yeah.
More questions? In the context of this difference you made between metaphysical and epistemic idealism, what would be the place? Of course, Lichtenberg is an epistemic idealist, not a metaphysical idealist. It's not substantial in any way possible. But what would be the place of experimentalism in this context, in the context of an epistemic idealism? There's some efficacy of the prétendance in the experimentalism.
Yeah, okay. So I mean, you mean experiment, whenever people talk about experiments, I mean, there's the Gedanken experiment, but you mean in this sort of very practical way when they do business. Yeah, I mean, I think there, when he reflects on it, the idea is that what scientists will do is first look at impressions, determine whether those are dependent on their will or not. So you're doing an experiment and you think really hard about changing it, and that doesn't happen. And so from that, you can infer that whatever the phenomenon is, that has some cause in objects greater knows. But I think that the problem for him is how to make sense of how we can make true or false statements about natural phenomena, because we're sort of tracking representations. He can't do he doesn't do the Kantian transcendental philosophy. He's just not that systematic, or maybe not that smart or something, so he doesn't have that way of understanding how judgments can still have objective validity or something despite this sort of restricted idealism or conquest. And for him, I think that's where he'll often talk about coherence of judgments. But that, I mean, that, if you're trying to think, well, is this a really viable philosophy or something? Well, that, I mean, it has problems too. and lots of people could be, all the scientists could be mistaken about what they, about their judgments. You know, there'd be sort of global confusion about things. But I guess that's, I mean, that's, as far as I can see, that's what we're left with. On the other hand, it's really, I mean, that sort of coherentist notion of truth is pretty interesting. As far as I know, nobody else that I can think of is really saying things like that, so it's an interesting contribution in that way. It puts us sort of more in a sort of intersubjective way of even scientists working together, if you think of it as sort of practical, from a practical point of view of how scientists do their work, you know. You're left with kind of a place where they have to compare their judgments with one another and try to make them coherent.
So, other more questions? Yeah.
Sorry about my argument. It's in the same way. About the representation of the real thing when you refer that in your exposition, your intervention. Representation of the real thing. Maybe could you explain some way about that? Maybe in a relation with language or representation. What is the representation, the real thing? If we accept that language is a suspension or doesn't exist, or we can use the eye or the language as a phenomenon that doesn't exist. Certainly it doesn't exist.
Maybe I'm not so clear, but is sort of the question when we use the term real thing, and if we accept this initial starting point with Lichtenberg, where we just have representations, then this whole discussion of objects creating notice or real things is really just also trapped within this sort of idealist position, right? So it's not clear whether real thing actually refers to anything out there. Is that the idea of